Hi, welcome to Lesson 3 of City Vision University's Nonprofit Educational Program Design course. I'm Andrew Sears, and in this week we're going to be focusing on designing education to support nonprofit program outcomes. So the learning outcomes for this lesson, the first part, what we want you to do is to summarize the components that make up a logic model for your organization's holistic program. And I'll explain a little more of what I mean by that later. And then to develop a detailed theory of change and logic model for your organization's holistic support program, and explain how your educational program components will support the larger program or organizational outcomes. So that's going to be your final project, part 2. Now, just again to remind you, we're in the analysis phase of the ADDIE process. And in this week, you're going to be really looking at how is all of this that you're doing fitting into the organization's mission, their program outcomes, and thinking about program staff input. So this is internal stakeholder needs and priorities. Now, one of the hardest things about this week is to recognize that we're actually integrating two disciplines that do the same thing, but they have different methodologies. So you have academic instructional design, or kind of the education domain, and then you have nonprofit program design and evaluation. So both of these would be college courses, and they both do evaluate outcomes, but they have slightly different methodologies. Kind of if you're familiar with screwdrivers, you might have different heads like Phillips or standard heads, and they do the same thing, but they use different methodologies. So let me explain how this is kind of all fits together. So everything that the organization does needs to fall under the educational mission. And then you're going to have program outcomes for the nonprofit program. Now this week, you're focused on something called a logic model and theory of change. And those are ways of framing the program outcomes. And while we're up here, we're following the nonprofit program outcome model. Now, as you go down, you're going to have educational program learning outcomes, and those are going to start to follow this educational program outcome model. And as we go deeper later, we'll talk about the differences in future weeks on this, but we're not going deep on this part. This week is just focused on logic models and theory of change. But the whole idea of these logic models, the reason why it's called a logic model is because one thing kind of proves another, and you're supposed to, the proof and evidence is supposed to move up. So each level needs to fit within the scope and level above it. So if you're doing something outside the organization mission, then you got a problem. If you're doing something outside the program purposes, you have education that's outside the program purposes, then that's a problem. And you're going to have outcome measures that provide evidence that the outcomes above it were achieved. So the idea is that you have educational program learning outcomes that those, if you prove those were achieved, then that should prove that the program outcomes were achieved. Now, as we go through this, we're going to be distinguishing between your educational program learning, or your educational program, and then other program activities. So as I mentioned, you might have a residential recovery program that has work therapy and has case management, and but those aren't necessarily educational. In terms of, you have like a course or something like that. I mean, on one level, everything's educational, right? But we're trying to be a little more formal. Now, as you go down this, you have the educational program learning outcomes. And then you might have course learning outcomes for one course. So you might have a course in budgeting. And then you have another course where you're going to teach, people Bible or something like that. And then under the course learning outcomes, you're going to have lesson learning outcomes. And then you're going to have a lesson plan. Now, one thing that is important for the purposes of this course, we use the terms outcomes and objectives synonymously. So if you ever hear the word objectives, we're talking about the same thing as outcomes. That's not always the case. But as we go later in the course, and I think future weeks, we're going to go more into educational program outcomes models. And here you use things like Bloom's taxonomy and other things. Whereas the nonprofit educational program model doesn't use that. Now, you're developing an educational program plan. Now, the scope of this plan is basically going to be covering all of these things. Now, you need to relate it back to the program outcomes and educational mission, but you're not writing an entire program. So that's the basics of how all this relates. Now, as we go through the course, week 3, you're going to be going through program outcomes. That's the focus of this week. Week 5, you're going to be looking at educational program learning outcomes. Week 6, you're going to be focused on course learning outcomes. So, you'll design a course syllabus. Week 7, you're going to be doing lesson learning outcomes, and you'll design a lesson plan. So that's how all these things build, and we want you to learn for each of these. But as you're designing your lesson learning outcomes, you need to make sure that they support your course learning outcomes, support your educational program learning outcomes, and support your overall, assuming you're in an organization that has a holistic program. Now, some of you may be in an organization that your program is just standalone and you're trying to get people a GED or a high school equivalency. And in that case, these two might get somewhat combined. So let me talk a little bit about logic models and theories of change. Now, we have a lot of reading on logic models this week, and a lot of reading in videos also that cover theories of change, and it can be a little confusing between the two. Logic models graphically illustrate program components and help identify outcomes, inputs, and activities. And I'll talk a little more about the details of those. They usually start with a program and you're just breaking down the components, so it's analysis. And it requires identifying the program component so you can see at a glance if outcomes are out of sync with inputs and activities, but they don't necessarily show why the activities are expected to produce those outcomes. And in many ways, I like to think of logic models as more of a left brain analysis type of thing, whereas theories of change is a little bit more of a right brain, holistic, and creative. But the purpose, theories of change, the purpose really is about the why. So they're going to be helping you link outcomes and activities to explain how and why the desired change is coming about. And so you may start with a program, but usually you're best with starting with a goal. So you might say, I want to help get people sober. And then you start to, or you might want to say, I want to help, transition someone from being homeless to being a productive member of society and sober. And then you have to figure out, okay, what are the approaches that are needed? What are the steps that are going to require to do that? And then you have justifications of those steps. And part of the idea behind a theory of change is the theory. So you have hypotheses. You say, well, I think for someone to be able to, not be homeless in the long term, then it's going to be helpful for them to have marketable job skills, to have the soft skills that they need, and to be, not addicted, so to be sober. And those are preconditions that need to be met. And if you're a religious organization, a Christian organization, you might say, it's going to really help for them to be following Jesus. And the idea is, are these preconditions, really needed in these things? And if you don't, have some of the preconditions, sometimes people will say church attendance, is that a precondition for success? So graphically, what this looks like, a theory of change might look like this. So you have the long-term outcome. We want people to be, contributing to society, independent, no longer homeless. And then you might say, necessary precondition that leads up to that is basically, and, then you would explain the why. And these are going to be activities and outcomes that have to be achieved before the long-term outcome. Now, let me just bring this as an example that will probably be helpful for a lot of people. So Citygate Network used to be called the Association of Gospel Rescue Mission. So they are an association of over 300 Christian residential recovery programs and programs that often serve the homeless. So this is basically their theory of change. So, step one is to be saved. And they're not just talking about, saved as making a decision to follow Jesus, but they summarize it as making choices that will help keep them from chronic illness and physical death. And then sober. So that's the next step. You want people to be sober, then you want people to be stable. So you might provide case management and counseling. Then under the schooled, it's, the difference between schooled and skilled. This is more knowledge focused. This is more, what can you do focus that will help you get a job. Then secure means that they would get a job, and settled, get a place to live. And then serving is actually giving back to the community. So, in many ways for rescue missions, you have shelter and food programs, and often from a community development perspective, that's called relief. Then you have residential recovery program that fits into the rehabilitation phase, and then you have aftercare and transition program, and that's what I would call it's development, but it's more individual development. Community development would be if you kind of had a whole community transition into that. And the idea of their theory of change is you need to maintain all of these to have a long-term successful outcome. And that's the basics of the theory of change. Now, I'm going to give you an even more simple model that is really the best long-term study I've seen of a large residential recovery ministry. Now, their logic model, so this organization had $150 million in their residential recovery ministry. So, and that included, staff, facilities, and other things. Then the outputs, so they had 7,500 participants in a 6-month residential work therapy ministry. And then out of that, their short-term outcome was they had 2,500 graduate from the program. Their long-term outcome is they defined it as remaining sober for 12 months after graduation. Now, their theory of change, what was interesting is they actually did data to try to figure out, what is needed for success, because the City 8 model, there's a lot of steps. They actually broke it down even more simple than theirs. What they found is, and they tested this. So they tested their theory, and they said that people will remain sober for 12 months. 80% will remain sober for 12 months, which is a phenomenal rate, to be honest. I mean, better than anything out there if they have, number one, a job, number two, housing, and number three, a supportive church community. So their theory of change is you need these three things, and then people are going to remain sober. Part of what was interesting is that if people don't have these three things, then the success rate to remain sober is 10%. So that's huge in terms of giving a very concrete theory of change. Now, often logic models are a lot more detailed than what I provided here. This is kind of a summary. What a more detailed logic model is going to look like is like this. So you have all these resources. You might have the staff, the facilities, the support, the different partnerships, and then you have different activities. And part of what I've done in your assignment, I ask you to bold in your logic model. So this is what I want you to do. So these are the academic activities. So they have these classes, but then they have non-academic activities. They have mental health care. They have case management. And then same thing with the outputs. So the outputs is, measuring the number of people in these. And then they have other outputs that are non-academic. And on the outcomes, the way they've defined their outcomes, it's hard to delineate and say this is only an educational outcome. An example of only an educational outcome might be, getting someone a GED or high school equivalency. But a lot of these are going to relate. They're more holistic outcomes. Then you have, the short term and then the long term outcomes. And this is, just looking at some of the activities of, this is Union Rescue Mission in Los Angeles, the largest rescue mission in the country. And what they've done is they've listed out some of their activities. So they say, we have this many, Bible and recovery classes, educational, vocational training, spiritual devotions, and then they have other components. So part of the reason why I have listed things this way is I want you to be able to identify, okay, what are the educational components of a holistic program? And these are the educational components. These are the things I would say aren't, categorized as educational components. So the work therapy, the biblical 12-step program, the physical fitness, the Sunday church attendance, the individual counseling. So if you're trying to delineate, outcomes and activities, this would be the way I would encourage you to split that. And then this is this is out of St. Matthew's House, but they have different modules that they'll go through, and this is the educational components that they take people through. And they're training people in these, different topics as they go through. And many of these things would be activities. So one of the most confusing aspects about this is, what is a short-term activity? What is a medium-term activity, and what is a long-term activity? And part of what makes this also challenging is the academic model of measuring outcomes doesn't really delineate this very well, whereas the nonprofit model delineates this better. So we're going to focus on the nonprofit model. But short-term outcomes generally are going to be attitude, knowledge, or skills. So most of academic outcomes, really, in the educational outcomes, like Bloom's taxonomy, fall within the short-term outcomes domains. So an example might be, you learn the causes of addiction, you might learn spiritual disciplines, you might learn some skills to maintain sobriety. Or, on the attitude, you value budgeting, you know about budgeting, you can set up a budget. Now, the medium-term outcome related to both of those, so that's going to be behavior. So maintaining sobriety, attending church weekly 1 year after a program. Or on the budgeting example, you might value and know a budget, but are you actually setting up and following a budget? So that would be the behavior, right? And then the long-term outcome is, that you're employed, actively following God, sober, with stable housing 2 years after the program. Or on the budgeting, maintains stable housing and a job, and increases savings after 2 years. And partially of that is because they're effectively following a budget. Now, I talked about, these different taxonomies in learning outcomes. Now, within the academic context, you have 3 domains of learning. You have the cognitive, that's the head, the affective, that's the heart, and the psychomotor, that's the hand. Now, within the academic world, and we'll go a lot deeper in this, you start with remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, and then creating is kind of the peak of that. Then you have the same thing at the affective. So receiving, valuing, and then characterizing your values. And then psychomotor, if you're teaching someone to, be a welder, you might be able to imitate, do some minor manipulation, being able to do it precisely, and that, this would be like you're an expert natural, welder. And most of these typically are going to be short-term outcomes. Sometimes you get to medium-term outcomes up here. And most long-term outcomes typically aren't measured by learning taxonomy. Sometimes they might be for characterizing values. Like if you say the long-term outcomes is living like Jesus, then that would be a long-term outcome, right? So let me talk a little bit about how you can tie education outcomes to program outcomes. So you have a program level outcome, PLO. Your PLO remains sober for 12 months. Then your educational program level outcome would be describe the factors contributing to their addiction. So that's a cognitive outcome. Then display and establish habits and boundaries to maintain their sobriety. That's an affective outcome. And then another example might be to secure and maintain employment. So that's a program level outcome. And then your education outcome might be to achieve high school equivalency. So that's cognitive. Another one might be to secure employable skill or trade. And that's actually going to probably combine cognitive, affective, and psychomotor for most people. And then to display an attitude needed in a work environment to be a good employee. That's largely going to be affective domain. And then to have stable housing. So that largely relates to employment. So you might have maintain their money effectively. Now there's going to be other outcomes that would contribute to that. To be in a supportive church community, you might have an educational program learning outcome that describe the importance of Christian community and spiritual disciplines to maintain their sobriety. That would be cognitive, if they're able to explain the importance of that. But then the affective would be to value and have established habits of Christian community and spiritual disciplines to maintain their sobriety. So that's going to be a difference. So for the last part of this lesson, I want to go and just talk about the final project. So you're going to go through and relate things to your organization mission statement. And then this first part here is going to go, and this is kind of the long form description of your logic model. Now down below, you're going to do a logic model, what we showed, where you're going to have inputs, outputs, and outcomes. And then you're going to have, here is where you're going to basically summarize your theory of change. Now you could get into a very detailed theory of change, and that's just too much for this course. So in other courses, we're going to go deeper on theory of change. So we just want you to kind of give your best summary of the theory of change. So you might say, like the example I used with this, with the residential recovery program, what are the factors that needs to happen for your long-term change to happen? And then you're going to, summarize those there. Now the external factors that impact change might be, so if you have a residential recovery program, then there might be two big external factors. Right now, COVID, if the COVID epidemic is significant for your organization, that would be an external factor. You may find that your, relapse rate is going up because people are stuck inside and, jobs and, other problems. But you might also have another external factor. I've seen other, residential recovery programs and the different drugs in their region change, and they find that, people who had been using, lighter drugs, all of a sudden are using meth or are using heroin, and they're seeing that the ability to get off of those drugs is, it's much more difficult. So that might be an external factor that, the epidemic of various drugs, that affect, your success rate. Or it might be massive changes in funding in your region, or, in some domains or some parts of the country, if you're supporting, serving homelessness, some cities will have the number of homeless double in a period of a couple of years. So that's really what this is about. Now, if you're someone who's more graphical, you could add an illustration using whatever illustration tool you want, computerized illustration tool, to explain your theory of change. And I think that there's a drawing tool that you can use here if you want to use the drawing tool, but that's not something that you necessarily need to do. So, and then the last thing I want to show is how this works in an academic model. In an academic model, you have something called a curriculum map. So we have one of these for each of our academic programs. And the way this works is we have all of our courses that are over here. Then we have the program outcomes. So we have 6 program outcomes. And then in the curriculum map, we need to show in our required courses that we achieve all of the program outcomes, plus they're going to have to take, students will take the elective outcomes. So the idea behind this logic model is we need to be able to show that students, every student who graduates will have achieved all of these outcomes, and we have these things: introduce, reinforce, and assess. And each of our, we will have courses that will assess to make sure, if someone takes the social entrepreneurship course, then we know by the time they finish that course, they've achieved our innovation outcome. And that's kind of how the logic model works for academic programs. So hopefully all this is helpful. Let me just say, this week is a challenging week. So you may want to watch some of these videos twice to get this stuff right. If you're not familiar with it, you may want to read it a couple times. This is a little bit more difficult than other weeks. So if it feels difficult, then view this like a challenging math problem, and study it twice, and hopefully you'll get that. You could always Google some of these concepts more to learn more about them too if you're finding it difficult. And if you have questions, please ask your faculty member. So thanks a lot.